So, Poll highlights four ideas that I'd like to share with you or re emphasize with you as you think about representations of Native Americans and really, in general, think about the American West from about the age of Jackson all the way through to the beginning of the 20th century. So, one of the ideas that Poll mentions comes from a historian named Richard Slotkin, and it's the idea of the myth of the frontier. And I've got this quote up on the screen that I'd like you to take a look at. But I think the key idea here is that European Americans presented themselves as heroic fighters for goodness against forces of evil and darkness. And so, even though it was European America that was marching across the continent and dispossessing Native Americans, European Americans were presented as the victims of Native American aggression again and again in art. And you see that continue right into 20th century films. So the myth of the frontier and how it worked to benefit the European, Anglo-European expansion is really important to understand and to look for how that's manifested in the paintings and works of art we're looking at. At the same time as the myth of the frontier is emerging, a long debate about the impact, the goal of assimilating Native Americans is going on. And actually, from our perspective, ironically, it's defenders of Native Americans who argue for assimilation at first, going all the way back to Jefferson as the only way that Native Americans can survive, really, basically, European Anglo aggression. Ultimately, that strategy backfires for 19th century Native Americans because Andrew Jackson and others will turn against them, and the most assimilationist tribe there was, the Cherokees, some of whom actually owned slaves, are one of the most brutally displaced tribes in American history and become, as we'll learn more about later, victims of the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act. So on the one hand, we've got this assimilation and the way it sort of doesn't work either way. It's a lose-lose for Native Americans. And then the other piece we have is this idea of syncretism, which is the idea that things are going to hybridize in smaller, lower key ways. And you want to look for both of these ideas in the art that we're looking at. Where are the markers of assimilation or resistance to assimilation? Where are the markers of syncretism or resistance to syncretism? So that's a second term that we want to be aware of. So far we have the myth of the frontier, assimilation, sync. Another idea we want to look for is this notion of a rhetoric of infantilization, where Anglo-Europeans are able to depict Native Americans as dependents or children as yet another justification for the actions of dispossession or paternalism that are taken by the Anglo-European settlers of the United States. So we want to look for images of that in representations of Native Americans. And a great example of those two different representations of the Indian queen, the coin and the image, and how one depicts a powerful, noble, heroic queen, and the other depicts one who's more of a supplicant, more of a dependent. And this is that trope of infantilization that we want to look for as we look for representations of Native Americans. I would argue also African Americans as we look at the imagery of slavery later in the class. Finally, the fourth idea we'd like to take a look at is the idea of the captivity narrative and the vulnerable woman versus the unrestrained savage. And this is part of the narrative of whites as the victims of Native Americans. Certainly, there were acts of violence committed by both sides, but the violence was initiated by the Anglo-Europeans who wanted land, and of course was far more catastrophic for the natives who were basically dispossessed and or decimated across the continent. So that the artists of this period decide to focus in and celebrate these acts of savage brutality is a way of supporting the larger ideology of justification, the ideology that rewards the culture of Anglo-Europeans and their actions against Native American tribes across the continent. All right, so those are four interesting ideas for you to think about as you're looking at this art. And I would argue any representations of Native Americans in American art, all the way through the Westerns of the American 50s, 60s, 70s, heck, Westerns up to today. Okay, see you in Canvas.